Well, hello and welcome back to the Conflict Skills Podcast. I'm your host, professional mediator Simon Good. In this podcast, I provide free resources and tools for dealing with conflict, whether that's related to workplaces or conflict outside of work. So if that sounds like that's kind of thing that's useful for you, please consider pressing follow or subscribe. In today's episode of the podcast, I'm going to be talking about how to decline an invitation. In this podcast, I'm going to be focusing on when that invitation comes from a colleague. And I'll talk about some options that you can use to do that, how to decline without hurting the other person's feelings. Now, I'm phrasing it that way because that's what I'm focusing on is the escalation process and some of the factors that we can use to sort of soften the blow, so to speak. And I'm not necessarily saying that you should always employ these skills, but when the relationship is important, when there's a lot at stake, I suppose you could use the same approach for clients where the relationship is important to the business or to yourself, or it could be a colleague where you're going to continue to work with them on an ongoing basis. Whereas in other situations, if you're not necessarily going to see the person again, or maybe you don't necessarily care about how they're feeling, if you know what I mean, I'm not sure that you would necessarily take the same approach that I'll talk about today, because it's an investment. If we're going to, decline the invitation in the way that's ideal, there's some effort involved. We might need to spend some time preparing or thinking through options about the best phrasing to use and the best language, etc. And then even in terms of the conversation itself, we might need to make effort and take time to schedule and meet the person and do it in a way that's particularly strategic or whatever. Whereas if it's not as important and there's not as much at stake, I think sometimes what we actually need to do is to accept the fact that we're just going to hurt the other person's feelings, so to speak. Like we might upset them. They might be a little bit resentful or upset or whatever. And that's maybe not necessarily something that we're responsible for. So that's the other part of it I wanted to mention just before we get into the different options that we could consider is, are you sure that it's necessarily your job to make the other person happy or to keep them happy or to avoid hurting their feelings or upsetting them, so to speak? If it is, let's think through some options that you can use. When I do de-escalation skills training, I often talk about 5 different factors that contribute to effective de-escalation. Of course, we've got other elements like tone of voice and body language and posture and eye contact and distance and sitting and standing and all those kind of things as well. But at least in terms of the actual issue itself, I tend to talk about 5 factors. They are status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. And so if we're thinking about a situation where we need to say no, maybe you've been invited for a social event, like maybe some colleagues said to you, do you want to grab a beer or grab a drink after work or something like that? Or it might be a professional context, like you've been invited to work on a project with somebody. I think these 5 factors can also be incredibly useful elements to consider in terms of how we actually say no. So we might be in a situation where we don't want to go or we don't want to be involved in the project or we can't for whatever reason, but we're wanting to convey the message that this is still important, this matters. So that's that first element that we should focus on, which is status. How can we help the other person to feel important? Now here we could talk about options like maybe making the person feel like you've prioritized it, like you've actually moved a number of things around to do your best to make sure that you could make it, but unfortunately, due to factors outside of your control, nevertheless, you're still not going to be able to be there. Or you could show how much you appreciate the invitation, like acknowledging the status of the other people that you might work on the project with. I often say something like, I really value these opportunities to work with interesting and intelligent people like yourselves. Unfortunately, at the moment, due to the existing commitments I have in my diary, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to commit to anything, at least in the next 2 to 3 month period. So that's another way of enforcing status, is to show how much you appreciate the invitation, or obviously sometimes you can do a little bit of ego massaging in the actual language that you can use as well. People love to be told that they're interesting as well, that they're unique, that they are creative, that kind of thing. I think that often really resonates. And part of it, I believe, is that there's no tangible evidence that can point to the contrary, if you know what I mean. Like it's ultimately just your subjective opinion, but you saying to something like, I really thought about this comment that you made that really resonated with me or left an impression. That tends to be something that some particular personalities, I believe, really resonate with. You could also emphasize the efforts that you've made to attend or explain why they are priority to you. You could talk about other alternatives, like maybe you could say something like, look, I just want you to know that if anything changes or I do have any dates become available, you'll be literally the first person that I call, as soon as that email comes through, I won't even have finished reading it before I'll be shooting you a message asking you if we can touch base. So it's kind of like you are the first on the cancellation list, so to speak, although of course we wouldn't use that kind of language with colleagues. And maybe there's a prime alternative that you can offer as well. Like if it was a romantic invitation that you were getting and, someone said, do you want to grab dinner or grab a drink? And you said, I can't make it tonight. Well, maybe you're offering them something that's like a real primo alternative. Like, what about Saturday night if that's something that's considered a little bit rare or a little bit prestigious? Like you meet the people that you really like on weekends, for example. Or it might be an event that's coming up in a couple of weeks. Like you can't make it to this, but how about we organise a time to hang out after the Christmas party, that kind of thing. So it's also maybe offering them the sense of status just through the, prioritization that you're giving to the meeting or to the appointment or to the party or to the project or whatever. The next factor that we could consider is autonomy. Now, here what we want to basically do is to give the other person the sense that they're in the driver's seat. Of course, if we just say, no, I can't do it this, but I can make it this date, we're not giving them any sense of choice. It's like, if you want to meet me, this is the only date that I'm available. Now, that might not necessarily be our intention. I think a lot of the time this is a message that we convey simply through our brevity of our language, unfortunately, but it's one of the potential interpretations that the other person might make, right? They don't care, or, oh, I see, it's their way or the highway, that kind of thing. Now I see how much they really value the relationship, that kind of thing. So what we want to do instead is to give the other person the sense of control over the situation that we're in. Like the obvious option might be giving them a number of options for rescheduling. I can't make it this week, but do either of these dates below work for you? Or, look, I can't make it on this project, but I've got these other couple of options coming up. Do they sound like the kind of thing that you might be interested in being involved in? And in that way, we'll still have the opportunity to work together, albeit in a slightly different context. So giving multiple dates or multiple options even in terms of ways to meet up with them. And then those phrasings like, I'd love to reschedule. Does this or this work for you? I'm happy to be flexible. Here are some options below, but let me know if that doesn't work and I'll do my best to be available, that kind of thing. And follow through, of course, with any of those kind of options that you do make. The third factor that we could consider is certainty. Here, what we want to do is to provide clear and specific information. Clarity reduces anxiety. The higher level of uncertainty that people have, the higher level of anxiety. So that's one element, I think, that makes certainty so effective, especially when we're declining invitations or saying no. But it also, I think, can reduce the ambiguity that can exist sometimes, like, I'm not sure if I can make it, that kind of thing. And so if you leave that kind of message on the table, so to speak, for a few different interactions with these colleagues, like, I'll see what I can do, I'm not sure if I can make it, I'll let you know. And then the day before you end up cancelling, of course that triggers a much higher level of frustration in the other person. And probably in hindsight, they would say something like, I wish you'd just told me. I wish I just knew where I stood. I just wish that we were on the same page, that kind of thing. So it does reduce the other person's anxiety and their tendency to escalate, but it can also be incredibly helpful at establishing some foundation for you to build the relationship from. I'm increasingly, as I've studied conflict now for over 10 years, becoming aware of the importance of being honest and transparent and telling the truth, I think, to a large extent. You don't necessarily need to say everything, but where you are communicating details, I think these fluffy, wishy-washy kind of reasons that we might give for declining an invitation, I mean, we can understand why we do it in the moment. We're nervous. Like, as we escalate, as our own fight or flight response trickles in, we don't want to upset the other person. We're wired for this. Like, historically, throughout evolution, this has been an incredibly risky thing to do with our tribe. If we enter into conflict and, upset somebody, that's not good for us. If they're not going to share food with us, we're not going to eat. So we don't want to upset people. And so these white lies, these wishy-washy, ambiguous statements, like I'll see what I can do, just slip off our tongue before we even think about it. And literally that's how it works. It's before the rational part of our brain has properly processed the language that we're going to use. So we don't want to upset them. So we give them this lack of certainty and it causes problems. So the next factor that you could consider is, what's the information that you can give them to let them know where things stand? So be specific about when and where you can't attend. Like if there are particular dates that you can't make it, let them know when you are and when you aren't available. And then set very clear expectations. If you're not sure if you can make it, I often think you probably confirm as early as possible, obviously, would be helpful. But being transparent about some of that, like the reason I'm not sure if I can attend is this, I'm not going to get that information until this date. I'm happy to do my best to let you know as soon as I can after that, but there's no way that I'm going to, be able to confirm ahead of time. If you'd prefer this or this, let me know if that would work better. Like give them autonomy even in terms of a possible alternative if your level of certainty isn't going to give them, the level of predictability that they need, so to speak. The fourth factor that we could consider is fairness. I mean, the obvious answer here is to show them that they are not the only one that's being singled out. Like let them know that this isn't personal. You've had to decline other projects or other invitations that you've had as well. It's not necessarily that you don't want to be involved. It's this particular time period. There might be some external factors that you could refer to, like there's a industry-wide change happening at the moment and it's introduced a higher level of work, or the fact that you're going through a period of being short-staffed within your team has meant that you've been working longer hours or something like that. This is the fairness element. We're wanting to show them that we're not saying no because we don't like them or there's a problem with them, so to speak. Of course, when the other person interprets criticism, the natural reaction is defensiveness. So here we want to basically explain that there are external factors, if that's true, that are behind your decision. So, for example, you could say things like, I've actually had to decline a number of other projects over the past month. All of them were ones that I was willing to work on, but I have to say, yours is the most enthusiastic that I've been amongst them. I'll know where I stand sometime in the next month or so. Would it be okay if I circle back to you then and maybe just shoot you a quick email and know if there's still an opportunity to participate at that stage? And then the final element that we could consider is relatedness. Here, what we want to do is to emphasize the relationship, to strengthen the connection despite saying no. We could acknowledge the importance of the project to them, for example, or how our saying no might negative impact on them, like show a little preemptive empathy. I'm aware this might put you in a tough spot, or I'm sorry, I know this kind of team isn't always easy to fill and find the right mix of people, something like that. You could also express a desire to maintain the relationship despite the fact that you're saying no. Look, I'd love to still work on other projects moving forward. These are a couple of options that I've been considering. Of course, we don't need to make any of these decisions at this stage. You could also talk about alternative ways to connect or celebrate, like if your workmates or colleagues have invited you out for a social kind of gathering, maybe there's a different kind of way to connect socially. Like, I can't make it tonight, guys, but I'd love to see what picks you put into the footy tipping competition this evening. Dazza, you've been having a rough trot. We'll see how you go. Ha, ha, ha. Like, it's sort of like we can still be mates despite the fact that I'm not coming to get a beer. Or I'm still interested in getting to know each other socially despite the fact that I can't come and attend this dinner, that kind of thing. So I really value our friendship. I really value the relationship. I'm disappointed I can't make it. I'd love to grab lunch next week if that's an option for you. So how does that sit with you, applying that de-escalation skills framework of status, relatedness, fairness, certainty, and autonomy to those situations where you need to decline an invitation and you need to say no? And I wonder, what other kinds of invitations might you be able to use those kind of tools in? Maybe there are other situations where you need to deliver bad news, for example, and they might also be 5 factors that you could consider. Or maybe there's an element of conflict within the social group and within your colleagues, and you're needing to be assertive. Well, these could also be 5 factors that you might like to introduce in terms of the phrasing and approach that you ultimately take. I'd love to know your thoughts in terms of, did the podcast resonate with you, you can leave a comment on the podcast platform that you're listening on, or otherwise shoot me an email. It's podcast@simongood.com. Otherwise, thank you very much for listening. If you're interested in my training workshops or the other work that I do, you can check out my website, simongood.com. If it has been useful and you'd like to support the podcast, just leaving a positive review or pressing subscribe or follow or interacting with it, so to speak, are the cues that the algorithm looks for to know that this might be the kind of thing that's useful for other people. And otherwise, thank you very much for listening. I hope that it has been helpful, and I would love to connect with you again in a future episode of the podcast. Bye for now.